She expected her mother to hide her. Instead, her mother opened the door and pointed. The American soldier stood in the doorway, rifles ready, and Margaret knew in that moment that betrayal cuts deeper than any bullet. They told her Americans would torture German prisoners. But when she arrived at Camp Co in Minnesota in the winter of 1945, 18 years old and shaking with cold, the enemy broke her not with cruelty, but with a cup of hot chocolate and a man who would teach her what a real father looked like. If this story moves you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more true stories from World War II that reveal the complicated truth about war, family, and humanity. The train rumbled through the German countryside in early March 1945. Margaret Fisher sat pressed against the wooden wall of the box car, her arms wrapped around her knees, trying to make herself as small as possible. She was 18, though she looked younger, thin, pale, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. She had been a radio operator for the Wehrmacht, one of thousands of young German women pulled into military service as the war consumed every available person. She had never fired a gun, never seen combat, but she had worn the uniform and worked in the communications center in Hamburg. That was enough to make her an enemy when the British troops rolled through. But it was not the British who had captured her. It was her own mother who had turned her in. Margaret still could not understand it. After Hamburg fell, she had made her way back to their small apartment, hoping to find safety, hoping to hide until the chaos settled. Her mother had opened the door, and for one brief moment, Margaret had seen relief in her eyes. Then the relief had hardened into something else, something cold and calculating. The next morning, American soldiers had knocked on the door. Her mother had answered. She had pointed to Margaret and said in broken English, she was Wehrmacht, radio operator. Just like that. No hesitation, no tears, just a finger pointing at her own daughter. Margaret had not cried when they arrested her. She had not cried during the interrogation. She had not cried when they loaded her onto this train with dozens of other captured German military personnel. But now, alone in the darkness of the boxcar, feeling the vibration of the tracks beneath her, she felt something break inside her chest. Her mother had chosen survival over her daughter. There was food being distributed by the occupying forces, and perhaps turning in a Wehrmacht auxiliary earned extra rations. Perhaps it earned favor. Perhaps it simply removed a burden. Margaret did not know, and the not knowing hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. The train journey to the port took 3 days. They were given water and thin soup twice a day, ladled through the small window in the boxcar door. Margaret drank, but could not eat. Her throat closed up every time she tried to swallow the watery broth. At night, she heard the other prisoners talking in low voices. Some were soldiers. Some were like her. Support personnel, clerks, drivers, cooks. All of them were afraid. They spoke of what the Americans might do to them. Torture, starvation, forced labor, death. The rumors were endless and terrifying. When they finally reached the port, Margaret saw the ship that would take them across the Atlantic. It was massive, gray, imposing. American sailors moved about the deck with practiced efficiency. The prisoners were marched aboard in lines, each one tagged with a number and a name. The Atlantic crossing took 2 weeks. Margaret spent most of it in the hold with the other women, lying in a narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and thinking about her mother's face. That moment when relief had turned to coldness, that finger-pointing. Those words. She was Wehrmacht. The ship's engines thrummed constantly, a deep vibration that she could feel in her bones. The air below deck smelled of diesel fuel, and too many bodies crowded together. Some women got sick from the rolling motion of the waves. Others cried at night, muffling their sobs in their thin blankets. Margaret didn't neither. She simply lay there, feeling empty, waiting for whatever came next. When the ship finally docked in New York, Margaret caught her first glimpse of America through a porthole. The skyline was enormous, buildings taller than anything she had ever seen, untouched by bombs, gleaming in the winter sunlight. It seemed impossible. All of Germany was rubble, but America looked like it had never known war. They were marched off the ship in lines, shivering in the cold March wind. American officers checked their papers and directed them to waiting trains. No one explained where they were going. No one told them what would happen. The prisoners simply followed orders, too exhausted and too frightened to ask questions. Margaret was put on a train heading west. For 3 more days they traveled through the American countryside. She pressed her face to the window, watching towns pass by. Small houses with neat yards, cars on the roads, people going about their lives as if there was no war at all. Children played in schoolyards. Shops were open. Everything looked clean, ordered, peaceful. It made her chest tighten. This was the enemy. These people who lived in houses with gardens. These children playing hopscotch. How could they be the monsters she had been warned about? The train finally stopped at a small station in Minnesota. The sign read, St. Paul. It was late afternoon and snow covered everything. The platform, the rooftops, the bare trees. Margaret had never seen so much snow. Hamburg rarely got more than a dusting. Buses were waiting. The prisoners were loaded on. 20 women per bus and driven north through the snow. Margaret sat by a window watching the landscape pass. Forests, frozen lakes, farmhouses with smoke rising from chimneys. Everything was white and silent and strange. After an hour, the bus turned through a gate marked Camp Co., U.S. Army. Margaret felt her heart start to pound. This was it. This was where her new life or her death would begin. The camp was smaller than Margaret had expected. Not a vast prison complex, but a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by a wire fence. Guard towers stood at the corners, but the guards in them looked almost bored, leaning against the railings, smoking cigarettes. The women were led off the bus and into a large building marked Processing. Inside, American soldiers sat behind desks, paperwork spread before them. They looked up as the women entered, but their expressions were not cruel or angry. They looked tired mostly and maybe a little curious. One by one, the women were called forward. Names were checked. Photographs were taken. Each woman was given a number and a file. When it was Margaret's turn, she stepped forward on shaking legs. The soldier behind the desk was older than the others, maybe in his late 40s, with gray hair and kind eyes. He looked at her paperwork and then looked up at her. Margaret Fisher, he read slowly, his accent thick, but his pronunciation careful. 1 year old radio operator. He glanced at her again. You look cold. Margaret did not know what to say. She was cold. She had been cold for weeks, but she did not think it mattered. The soldier, his name tag read Sergeant Miller, stood up and walked to a cabinet against the wall. He opened it and pulled out a thick wool blanket. He walked back and held it out to her. Here, he said, wrap this around yourself. Margaret stared at the blanket. This had to be a trick, a test. She did not move. Sergeant Miller's expression softened. It's okay, he said gently. You're safe here. Take the blanket. Slowly, Margaret reached out and took it. The wool was heavy and warm. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the cold start to recede. Good, Sergeant Miller said. He sat back down and made a note on her file. Now you'll be assigned to Barrack C's at 6 Mi. Someone will show you where to go. He paused, looking at her again. You're going to be okay, Margaret. I know you're scared, but you're going to be okay. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. She had expected cruelty. She had expected punishment. She had not expected kindness. Not from the enemy, not from anyone. After processing, the women were directed to the shower building. Margaret walked with the others, still clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Her heart pounded again. This was where it would happen, she thought. This was where the cruelty would start. They would strip them, humiliate them, break them down. But when they entered the building, it was not what she expected. The room was warm, heated by radiators along the walls, benches lined one side, and hooks held clean towels. A female American officer stood waiting, her uniform neat, her expression neutral, but not unkind. Welcome, the officer said in German, her accent American, but her words clear. You will shower here. Hot water, clean towels, new clothes will be provided. Take your time. Margaret and the other women exchanged glances. Could this be real? They were handed bars of soap. Real soap. White and fragrant. Not the rough lye soap they had used in Germany. Margaret held it in her hand, staring at it. It smelled like flowers. When was the last time she had smelled flowers? The showers had individual stalls with curtains. Margaret stepped into one, turned the handle, and gasped. Hot water. Actually, hot. It poured over her head, running down her back, washing away weeks of grime and sweat and fear. She stood there, eyes closed, letting the water run. And for the first time since her mother had betrayed her, Margaret began to cry. She cried silently, letting the water wash away her tears, her shoulders shaking. She cried for the mother who had pointed at her. She cried for the home that no longer existed. She cried for the fear and the exhaustion and the crushing loneliness. And somewhere beneath all of that, she cried because the enemy had given her hot water and soap, and she did not know what to do with that kindness. When she finally turned off the water and stepped out, a clean towel was waiting. So were new clothes. Not a uniform, but simple civilian clothes. A gray dress, thick socks, sturdy shoes. Everything fit reasonably well. Everything was clean. Margaret looked at herself in the mirror that hung on the wall. Her skin was pink from the hot water. Her hair, wet and clean, hung past her shoulders. She looked almost human again, almost like a person instead of a prisoner. Dinner was served in the Messal at 6:00, just as Sergeant Miller had said. Margaret followed the other women, still in a daze, still trying to understand what was happening. The Messal was large and warm, with long tables and benches. American soldiers worked behind a serving counter, ladelling food onto metal trays. The smell hit Margaret first. Roasted meat, bread, vegetables. Real food, not the watery soup, or the sawdust bread she had eaten for months. Real food. She picked up a tray and moved through the line. A soldier put a piece of roasted chicken on her plate. Another added mashed potatoes. Another gave her green beans and a thick slice of bread with butter. A cup of coffee was placed on her tray, steam rising from it. Margaret stared at the tray. This could not be real. There had to be a mistake. This much food. This was more than she had seen in a year. She found a seat at one of the tables and sat down. Around her, other women were eating, some slowly, some frantically, some with tears running down their faces. Margaret picked up her fork and cut a small piece of chicken. She put it in her mouth and began to chew. The taste exploded on her tongue. It was rich, savory, perfectly seasoned. She had forgotten food could taste like this. In Hamburg, everything had been bland or rotten or non-existent. But this was real chicken, cooked with care, served hot. She took another bite, then another. Before she knew it, she had eaten half the plate. Her stomach, shrunken from months of near starvation, began to protest, but she could not stop. She ate the mashed potatoes, the green beans, the bread with butter. She drank the coffee, bitter and strong and wonderful. When she finally put down her fork, she felt full for the first time, and longer than she could remember. Full and confused and utterly overwhelmed. Across the table, an older woman was crying into her hands. "My children," she whispered. "My children are starving in Berlin, and I am eating chicken." Margaret understood. The guilt was immediate and crushing. How could she eat this food when her mother, despite everything, might be going hungry when all of Germany was starving? How could the enemy feed her better than her own country ever had? After dinner, the women were shown to their barracks. Barrack C was a long wooden building with rows of bunk beds. Each bed had a mattress, 2 blankets, and a pillow. A small stove in the center of the room provided heat. Windows let in the fading evening light. Margaret was assigned a bottom bunk near the back. She sat down on it carefully, testing the mattress. It was thin but real, stuffed with something soft, not just straw. The blankets were wool, thick and heavy. The pillow smelled clean. She lay down, pulling the blankets up to her chin, and stared at the ceiling. Around her, other women were settling in, whispering to each other, some crying softly, some already asleep. The barracks were warm. The bed was soft. Her stomach was full. Margaret closed her eyes and felt the exhaustion wash over her. She had not slept properly in weeks. But now in this place, this enemy camp, she felt safe enough to let go. Just before sleep took her, one thought circled through her mind. They were told the Americans were monsters. But monsters do not give you hot water and chicken and warm beds. What did that mean? What did any of this mean? The first full day at Camp Co began at 7 in the morning. A bell rang, waking the women. Margaret sat up in her bunk, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. Around her, the other women were stirring, stretching, some groaning at the early hour. Breakfast was at 7:30. Margaret walked to the mess hall with a group of women from her barracks. The morning was cold, the Minnesota air sharp and clean. Snow crunched under their feet. The sun was just rising, turning the sky pink and gold. Breakfast was eggs, toast, oatmeal, and coffee. Again, it was more food than Margaret had seen in months. She ate slowly this time, her stomach still adjusting to regular meals. The eggs were scrambled and buttery. The toast was thick and warm. The oatmeal had brown sugar and raisins. After breakfast, work assignments were handed out. Margaret and several other women were assigned to the camp laundry. It was not hard work, sorting clothes, operating the washing machines, hanging things to dry. The laundry room was warm and steamy, filled with the smell of soap and clean cotton. The work was supervised by an American soldier, a young corporal named Davies. He showed them how to operate the machines, demonstrated the sorting system, and then mostly left them alone. He sat at a desk in the corner, reading a magazine, occasionally glancing up to make sure everything was running smoothly. Margaret worked mechanically, her hands sorting uniforms and towels while her mind wandered. This was captivity. This was punishment. She was warm, fed, and doing laundry. It made no sense. Lunch was at noon. Sandwiches, soup, fruit. Dinner at 6 salt, meat, vegetables, bread. Every meal was substantial. Every meal was more than enough. And after dinner, the women had free time. They could write letters, read books from the camp library, listen to the radio in the recreation room, or simply sit and talk. By the end of the first week, Margaret had settled into the routine. Wake at 7 breakfast, work until lunch. Lunch, more work until 4 free time until dinner. Evening activities. Sleep. It was simple, predictable, almost boring. And yet, beneath the routine, confusion gnawed at her. This was not supposed to be her life. She was not supposed to be safe and warm and fed. She was supposed to be punished, broken, destroyed. That was what she had been told would happen. That was what she had expected. Instead, she was doing laundry and eating 3 meals a day and sleeping in a real bed. Instead, the enemy treated her with a strange, distant kindness that she did not know how to process. Sergeant Miller was a constant presence at Camp Co. He seemed to be in charge of the prisoner welfare section, and Margaret saw him often, checking on the barracks, talking to the guards, making sure supplies were adequate. He always had a kind word for the prisoners. He learned their names, asked how they were adjusting, listened when they had complaints or requests. Some of the women found it strange, others found it comforting. Margaret did not know what to think. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into her time at the camp, Margaret was walking back from the laundry when she passed Sergeant Miller. He was standing outside the administration building, smoking a cigarette and watching the snowfall. "Margaret," he said, recognizing her. "How are you settling in?" She stopped, unsure how to respond. "I am fine," she said carefully. Her English was limited, but functional. "Good," he said. "That's good." He took a drag on his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "You look better than when you arrived. Less scared." Margaret did not know what to say to that. She was less scared. It was true, but that almost made it worse. Fear, she understood. This strange safety was harder to navigate. Sergeant Miller seemed to sense her confusion. "It's okay to be confused," he said gently. I know this isn't what you expected. Hell, it's probably not what any of you expected. But we're not monsters, Margaret. We're just soldiers doing a job, and part of that job is making sure you're treated humanely. Why? The question came out before Margaret could stop it. Sergeant Miller looked at her, his expression thoughtful. Why treat you humanely? He considered the question. Because it's the right thing to do. Because you're people, not animals. And because this war is going to end someday, and when it does, we all have to live with what we did during it. He stubbed out his cigarette and looked at her again. You have family back in Germany? Margaret hesitated. A mother, she said finally. In Hamburg. You miss her? The question was like a knife. Margaret felt her throat tighten. I do not know. Sergeant Miller's eyes softened. That's an honest answer, he said quietly. Come on. Let's get you inside. It's cold out here. He walked her to the barracks, making small talk about the weather, the camp, the upcoming Christmas holidays. When they reached the door, he paused. Margaret, he said, if you ever need to talk, my office is in the admin building. Doors always open. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. That night, lying in her bunk, Margaret thought about that conversation. Sergeant Miller reminded her of someone, though she could not quite place who. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet strength that felt familiar, and for reasons she did not fully understand. Being around him made her feel less alone. The women at Camp Coma were allowed to write letters home. They were given paper, envelopes, and stamps. The letters would be reviewed by censors before being sent. But they could write. Margaret sat in the recreation room one evening with a blank piece of paper in front of her, a pencil in her hand. Around her, other women were writing, their faces intent, some crying as they worked. She wanted to write to her mother. She wanted to ask why. Why did you turn me in? Why did you choose food rations over your daughter? Why did you point at me with no hesitation? But she could not write those words. They were too raw, too angry, too painful. Instead, she wrote, Mother, I am alive. I am in America in a camp for prisoners of war. They are treating us well. We have food and beds and heat. I do not know when I will come home. I do not know if I want to. Margaret. She read the letter over, her hand shaking slightly. The words seemed cold, distant, but they were the only words she had. She sealed the letter in an envelope, addressed it, and left it in the outgoing mailbox. She did not know if her mother would receive it. She did not know if her mother would care, but she had written it, and that felt like something. Weeks passed. No reply came. Margaret had not expected one, but the silence still hurt. As winter deepened, small acts of kindness began to accumulate. Corporal Davies, who supervised the laundry, brought a radio one so the women could listen to music while they worked. He tuned it to a station that played classical pieces and American big band songs. The camp cook, a burly man named Sergeant O'Brien, started making special desserts on Sundays. Apple pie, chocolate cake, custard. He would stand in the serving line, grinning as the women exclaimed over the sweets. One of the guards, Private Johnson, taught some of the women how to play poker. They would gather in the recreation room in the evenings, betting with buttons and bits of string, laughing when someone won a big hand. Sergeant Miller continued to check in on the prisoners regularly. He brought extra blankets when the weather turned especially cold. He arranged for a German-speaking chaplain to visit the camp for those who wanted spiritual guidance. He made sure the library was stocked with German books and magazines. One December afternoon, Sergeant Miller found Margaret sitting alone in the recreation room, staring out the window at the snow. He sat down across from her. Christmas is coming, he said. First one away from home for you, I imagine. Margaret nodded. Christmas had always been her favorite time of year. Her mother would bake cookies and they would decorate a small tree and everything would smell like cinnamon and pine. But that was before the war, before the betrayal, before everything fell apart. We're planning a small celebration here, Sergeant Miller said. Nothing fancy, but we'll have a tree and some decorations, maybe some carols. I thought it might help. Why do you do this? Margaret asked suddenly. The question had been building in her for weeks. Why do you care about us? We are the enemy. Sergeant Miller was quiet for a long moment. I have a daughter, he said finally. Back home in Ohio. She's about your age. And I think about her every day. I think about what I would want for her if she was in your situation. He looked at Margaret, his eyes serious. You're not the enemy to me, Margaret. You're a scared kid who got caught up in something bigger than herself. And maybe I can't fix the war, and I can't send you home, but I can make sure you have a warm bed and a decent meal. That's something. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back. My mother did not think that way, she whispered. I know, Sergeant Miller said gently. And I'm sorry. That must hurt more than anything. They sat in silence for a while, watching the snow fall outside. Finally, Sergeant Miller stood up. You know what? He said. I'm going to get you some hot chocolate. Best cure for a cold day, I know. He disappeared into the kitchen and came back a few minutes later with 2 mugs of steaming hot chocolate. He handed one to Margaret and sat back down. Margaret took a sip. It was rich and sweet and warm, and it tasted like childhood. Like Christmas mornings, like everything she had lost. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. It's okay to cry, Sergeant Miller said. God knows you've earned it. So Margaret cried, sitting in an enemy camp in Minnesota, drinking hot chocolate with an American soldier who treated her with more kindness than her own mother had. And somewhere in that moment, something shifted. The wall she had built around her heart developed a crack. Small but undeniable. The weeks between Christmas and spring were the hardest. Margaret was physically comfortable, warm, fed, safe. But mentally and emotionally, she was in turmoil. Everything she had been taught was crumbling. The Americans were supposed to be brutal, savage, inhuman. But Sergeant Miller brought her hot chocolate. Corporal Davies played music for them. Sergeant O'Brien made special desserts. The guards taught them card games and shared cigarettes and asked about their families. How could this be the enemy? How could these men who showed her kindness be the same people who had bombed Germany? It did not make sense. Nothing made sense. At night, lying in her bunk, Margaret would replay her mother's betrayal over and over. She would see that moment, the door opening, the soldier standing there, her mother's finger pointing. She was Wehrmacht, radio operator. Why? The question tormented her. Was it for food? For safety? To prove her loyalty to the occupying forces? Or was it simply that her mother had never really loved her at all? Margaret had grown up believing family was everything. Blood was thicker than water. Mothers protected their children. That was the natural order of things. But her mother had not protected her. Her mother had sacrificed her. And now Margaret was here in an enemy camp, being protected by strangers. The irony was not lost on her. The enemy was kinder than her own family. What did that say about family? What did that say about the war? What did that say about everything she had believed? Sergeant Miller had told Margaret his door was always open, and she began to take him up on that offer. At first, she would just stop by to ask practical questions, where to get more writing paper, whether she could request a specific book from the library. But gradually, the conversations became deeper. Sergeant Miller was a good listener. He did not judge or lecture. He just listened and offered his thoughts when asked. One cold February afternoon, Margaret found herself in his office, sitting in the chair across from his desk, trying to put her confusion into words. I do not understand why you are kind to us, she said. We were your enemies. We worked for the Wehrmacht. We were part of the war machine. Sergeant Miller leaned back in his chair. Do you know what I did before the war, Margaret? She shook her head. I was a high school teacher history. And I taught my students that wars are fought between governments and armies, not between people. Most people just want to live their lives in peace. They want to raise their kids, do their work, have a little happiness. But then governments decide to fight, and ordinary people get swept up in it. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You were a radio operator. You were 18 years old. You didn't start this war. You didn't ask to be part of it. You were just doing what you were told to do, same as millions of other people on both sides. That doesn't make you evil. It makes you human. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. But I wore the uniform. I served. So did I, Sergeant Miller said. Does that make me evil too? I dropped bombs on Germany. I killed people. Does that make me a monster? I do not know. Neither do I, Sergeant Miller admitted. That's the hell of war, Margaret. There are no easy answers. Good people do terrible things. Bad things happen to innocent people. And in the end, we all just have to live with what we did and try to be better. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. My mother turned me in, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She pointed at me and told the soldiers I was Wehrmacht, her own daughter. Sergeant Miller's expression softened. I know, you told me. Why would she do that? How could she do that? I don't know, Sergeant Miller said honestly. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she thought turning you in would protect her. Maybe she was desperate. People do desperate things when they're afraid. Does that make it okay? No, Sergeant Miller said firmly. It doesn't. What she did was wrong. Betraying your child is always wrong, no matter the circumstances. But understanding why someone did something doesn't mean you have to forgive them. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to hurt. Margaret felt tears building again. I hate her, she whispered. I hate her for what she did. That's okay too, Sergeant Miller said gently. Hatred is a natural response to betrayal, but don't let it eat you alive. Margareta, don't let her choices destroy you. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Margaret looked up at him. You remind me of someone, she said. I could not figure out who, but now I know. My grandfather. He died when I was 10. He was kind like you. He listened like you do. He made me feel safe. Sergeant Miller smiled, a sad, gentle smile. I'm honored by the comparison. My father died when I was 5. Margaret continued. I barely remember him. And my mother? Well, you know about my mother. I thought I did not have family anymore. But maybe. She trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. Family isn't always about blood. Sergeant Miller said, sometimes it's about who shows up for you, who cares about you, who treats you with kindness when you need it most. Margaret nodded, her throat tight. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Oh, you're welcome, kiddo, Sergeant Miller said. And in that moment, Margaret felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like someone's daughter again. As winter gave way to spring, the snow melted and the camp began to change. The days grew longer, the air grew warmer, and Margaret began to change too. She gained weight, her cheeks filling out, her body growing stronger. The dark circles under her eyes faded. Her hair, which had been dull and lifeless, began to shine again. She looked healthy. She looked alive. More than that, she began to smile. At first it was just small smiles. A brief upturn of her lips when Sergeant O'Brien made a joke. A quiet laugh when one of the women told a funny story. But gradually, the smiles came more easily. She made friends among the other prisoners. There was Elsa, a former nurse from Berlin, who had a dry sense of humor and a talent for card games. There was Greta, who had been a typist and who sang beautifully. There was Anna, an older woman who had worked in a factory and who took Margaret under her wing like a mother hen. They would sit together in the evenings talking about their lives before the war, sharing memories, dreaming about the future. It felt good to belong to something again, even if it was a group of prisoners in an enemy camp. One warm April evening, Sergeant Miller found Margaret sitting outside the barracks, watching the sunset. He sat down beside her on the steps. You look happy, he observed. Margaret considered that. I think I am, she said, surprised by her own answer. Is that wrong? Should I not be happy? Why would it be wrong? Because I am a prisoner. Because my country lost the war. Because people I knew are dead or suffering. Sergeant Miller shook his head. Happiness isn't something you have to earn, Margaret. It's not something you need permission for. You're allowed to be happy even in hard circumstances. Maybe especially in hard circumstances. She thought about that. I think I was never really happy before, she said slowly. Even before the war. My mother was always cold, distant. I thought that was just how mothers were. But now being here, seeing how you treat us, how the other soldiers treat us, I realize it did not have to be that way. No, it didn't. Sergeant Miller agreed. You deserved better. Every child deserves better. Margaret turned to look at him. Can I ask you something? Of course. When the war ends, when we are sent back to Germany, will I ever see you again? The question hung in the air. Sergeant Miller was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, he said honestly. Probably not. But that doesn't mean what we have here doesn't matter. These months, these conversations, this connection, it's real. And you'll carry it with you wherever you go. I do not want to go back, Margaret admitted. I know I am supposed to want to go home, but I do not. There is nothing for me there. No family, no future, just ruins. I understand, Sergeant Miller said. And I wish I could promise you that you can stay, but I can't. When the war ends, prisoners will be repatriated. That's just how it works. Margaret felt her eyes burn with tears. It is not fair. No, it's not, Sergeant Miller agreed. But life rarely is. All we can do is make the best of what we have while we have it. He put his arm around her shoulders, a fatherly gesture that made Margaret's chest tighten. You're going to be okay, Margaret. You're strong. You're smart. You've survived so much already. Whatever comes next, you'll survive that too. Margaret leaned against him, letting herself be held, letting herself feel safe. Thank you, she whispered. For being like a father to me, for showing me what that means. You're welcome, sweetheart, Sergeant Miller said softly. You're welcome. In May 1945, the war in Europe ended. The news came over the radio one evening, crackling through the speakers in the recreation room. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich was finished. The women at Camp Co gathered around the radio, listening in stunned silence. Some cried, some sat in shock, some simply stared at nothing, trying to process what it meant. For Margaret, the news brought a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the killing was over, grief for all that had been lost, fear about what came next, and underneath it all, a deep, aching sadness. The war was over. Soon she would be sent back to Germany, back to her mother who had betrayed her, back to a country in ruins, back to nothing. That night, Margaret could not sleep. She lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she got up and walked outside. The night was warm, the air soft with the promise of summer. Stars scattered across the sky, more stars than she had ever seen in Hamburg with its city lights. She stood in the middle of the yard, arms wrapped around herself, and felt the weight of everything crash down on her. She heard footsteps behind her, and turned to see Sergeant Miller. He was in civilian clothes, just a shirt and trousers, and he looked tired. Couldn't sleep either, he asked. Margaret shook her head. He came to stand beside her, and they stood in silence for a while, looking up at the stars. I am afraid, Margaret said finally. I am afraid to go back. I know, Sergeant Miller said. I would be too. Here, I feel safe. Here, I feel valued, like I matter. But back there, she trailed off, unable to finish. Back there, you'll have to rebuild, Sergeant Miller said. And it won't be easy. But Margaret, listen to me. You do matter. You always did. Your mother's actions don't define your worth. Nothing can take that away from you. Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. I do not know if I can face her again. I do not know if I can forgive her. You don't have to, Sergeant Miller said firmly. Forgiveness is a choice, not an obligation. You can choose to forgive her, or you can choose to walk away. Either way is okay. He turned to face her, placing his hands on her shoulders. But whatever you choose, promise me something. Promise me you won't let her betrayal define the rest of your life. Promise me you'll find a way to be happy, to build something good, to remember that there are people in this world who care about you. Margaret looked up at him through her tears. Like you. Like me, he confirmed. You're like a daughter to me, Margaret. I know that sounds strange given the circumstances, but it's true. And even when you're gone, even when we're half a world apart, that won't change. You'll always be in my heart. Margaret broke down then, sobbing into his shoulder as he held her. She cried for her lost childhood, for her mother's betrayal, for the war and all it had destroyed. But she also cried with something like gratitude, because this man, this enemy soldier, had shown her what love looked like, what a real father looked like. When the tears finally subsided, Sergeant Miller pulled back and looked at her. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It was a picture of him, with his wife and daughter standing in front of a house. "This is my family, back in Ohio. My wife Mary, my daughter Elizabeth. She's 19 now." He pressed the photograph into Margaret's hand. "I want you to have this, to remember that you are not alone. That somewhere in the world, there's a family that considers you part of them." Margaret looked down at the photograph, at the smiling faces, and felt something break open inside her. Not a breaking that hurt, but a breaking that healed. Like ice cracking in the spring thaw, letting the water flow again. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for everything." Sergeant Miller pulled her into another hug. "You're going to be okay, kiddo. I promise." In August 1945, 3 months after the war ended, the women of Camp Ka were told to prepare for repatriation. Ships were being arranged. They would be going home. The announcement brought mixed reactions. Some women were thrilled, desperate to return to their families. Others, like Margaret, felt only dread. The final weeks at camp passed too quickly. Margaret tried to memorize everything. The way the sunlight streamed through the windows of the rec room, the smell of Sergeant O'Brien's cooking, the sound of Elsa's laugh, the feeling of safety that had become so familiar. On her last day, Sergeant Miller called her to his office. When she arrived, she found he had prepared something special, a small care package with food, a blanket, and a letter. "For the journey," he said, "and for when you arrive." The letter was addressed to her, written in his careful handwriting. She opened it with shaking hands. "Dear Margaret," it read, "by the time you read this, you'll be on your way back to Germany. I won't pretend I know what you're facing. I won't pretend it will be easy. But I want you to know that you have the strength to handle whatever comes. You've already survived so much. Remember what I told you. Your mother's choices don't define your worth. You are valuable. You are loved. You matter. And somewhere in Ohio, there's a man who thinks of you as a daughter and always will. If you ever need anything, if you ever want to write, my address is at the bottom of this letter. Don't hesitate to reach out. You're not alone. You never were. Love, Frank Miller." Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she carefully folded it and placed it in her pocket next to the photograph. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for being my father when my own mother could not be my mother." Sergeant Miller hugged her one last time. "Be safe, Margaret. Be happy. Live a good life." The journey back to Germany was long and uncomfortable. The ship was crowded with returning prisoners, everyone anxious and uncertain about what they would find. When they finally arrived in Bremen, Margaret saw the devastation for the first time. The port city was a skeleton, buildings reduced to rubble, streets choked with debris. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed. From Bremen, she made her way to Hamburg. The journey took 3 days on overcrowded trains and buses. When she finally reached her old neighborhood, she almost did not recognize it. The apartment building where she had lived was still standing, but many around it were not. The streets were filled with wreckage. The sky above was gray. Margaret climbed the stairs to her mother's apartment, her heart pounding. She did not know what she would say. She did not know if she even wanted to see her mother, but she had to know. She had to understand. She knocked on the door. For a long moment, there was no answer. Then she heard footsteps, and the door opened. Her mother stood there, thinner than Margaret remembered, older, more worn. When she saw Margaret, her eyes widened. "Margaret," she breathed. Margaret looked at her mother, at the woman who had betrayed her, and felt a strange calm settle over her. "I came to tell you I am alive," Margaret said quietly, "and to tell you goodbye." Her mother's face crumpled. "Margaret, please." "No," Margaret interrupted. "You made your choice. You pointed at me. You turned me in. I spent months not understanding why, but now I realize it does not matter why. What matters is that you did it, and I cannot forgive that." She pulled out the photograph of Sergeant Miller and his family and looked at it. "I found a real family," she said. "People who cared about me, who protected me, who showed me what love looks like. They were supposed to be my enemies, but they were kinder to me than you ever were." Her mother was crying now, but Margaret felt nothing. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too complete. "I am leaving Hamburg," Margaret said. "I am going to Munich to find work, to start over. I do not know if I will come back. Maybe someday, maybe never, but I want you to know that I survived. Despite what you did, I survived." She turned to leave, but her mother reached out and grabbed her arm. "I was afraid," her mother whispered. "I thought if I turned you in, they would give me food. I thought you would be okay. I did not think. You did not think." Margaret agreed. "You chose yourself over your daughter, and that is something I will never forget." She pulled her arm free and walked away down the stairs, out of the building and into the gray Hamburg morning. She did not look back. Margaret found work in Munich as a secretary for a British occupation office. The work was steady, the pay was decent, and most importantly, it allowed her to build a new life, far from her past. She wrote to Sergeant Miller just as he had told her to. She told him about her confrontation with her mother, about her new job, about her slow efforts to rebuild. And he wrote back long, thoughtful letters that reminded her she was valued, that encouraged her to keep going, that told her about his life back in Ohio. Over the years, the letters continued. Sergeant Miller became simply Frank. He sent photographs of his daughter Elizabeth's wedding. He told her when his first grandchild was born. He shared the ups and downs of his life, and Margaret shared hers. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, Margaret met a man named Klaus. He was kind, patient, and understood that she carried wounds that might never fully heal. They married in 1953, and in 1955 they had a daughter. Margaret named her daughter Elizabeth after Frank's daughter, and when baby Elizabeth was born, Margaret wrote to Frank with the news. His response came a week later. "I am honored beyond words. Give that little girl a kiss from her American grandfather." As her daughter grew, Margaret told her the story about the war, about betrayal, about an American soldier who showed her that family is not always about blood. That sometimes the people who care for you the most are the ones you least expect. Elizabeth grew up knowing she had two grandfathers. One she had never met, who lived in Ohio, who sent birthday cards and Christmas presents, and who had saved her mother's life simply by being kind. In 1968, 23 years after the war ended, Frank Miller finally came to visit Germany. He was older now, gay-haired and slower, but his eyes were the same, kind and steady and full of warmth. Margaret met him at the Munich train station with her husband and her 13-year-old daughter. When she saw him step off the train, she ran to him, and he caught her in a hug that felt like coming home. "Hello, kiddo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Hello, Dad," Margaret said, and she realized it was the first time she had called him that out loud. But it felt right. It felt true. That week, Frank met Margaret's family. He walked with her through Munich, seeing the city that had risen from the ashes. They talked about the past and the present and the future. And on his last day there, sitting in Margaret's small apartment, drinking coffee and watching Elizabeth do her homework, Frank looked at Margaret and smiled. "You did it," he said. "You built a good life." I did, Margaret agreed. Because you showed me how. And so the cup of hot chocolate became more than a warm drink on a cold Minnesota night. It became a symbol of everything Margaret had learned about kindness, about family, about survival. Her mother had turned her in, but an enemy soldier had become her father. The contradiction was not lost on her. Years later, when her daughter asked her about the war, Margaret told her this. I learned that blood does not make family. Love makes family. Showing up makes family. Kindness makes family. And sometimes the people who save you are the ones you least expect. Frank Miller died in 1982 at the age of 73. Margaret flew to Ohio for the funeral, standing in a cemetery in a country that had once been her enemy, saying goodbye to the man who had been more of a father to her than anyone else. At the funeral, Frank's daughter, Elizabeth, approached her. Dad talked about you all the time, she said. He said you were his German daughter. He said saving you was one of the best things he ever did. Margaret smiled through her tears. He saved me, she said. In every way a person can be saved. This is the story worth remembering. Not just the battles or the politics, but the small human moments that reveal who we truly are. A mother who betrayed, a soldier who cared, a cup of hot chocolate that changed a life. These moments remind us that even in the darkest times, there is light. Even when family fails us, we can find family elsewhere. And even enemies can show us what love looks like. If this story touched you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more true stories from World War II that reveal the complicated truth about war, betrayal, and the enduring power of human kindness. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today. They remind us that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are not on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments when one person chooses to care for another. Thank you for watching. And remember, family is not always the one you are born into. Sometimes it is the